Okay, hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to another recurring guest. It's Richard Sakwa. He's an expert on Russia, Ukraine. He wrote, I think, a variety of books, and the important one that I read was the Frontline Ukraine, the crisis in the Borderlands, where he's been warning about this conflict that we stumbled in since, I think, since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. But Richard, welcome.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, so this war has gone on for almost 1 year now between Russia and Ukraine. And last time we spoke, we went through the sort of the historical context of this, everything building up. And I guess I want to ask you this: is any of that relevant at this stage?
It's even more relevant than ever before, because to understand and analyze the way we got into this, well, let's call it imbroglio or catastrophe, whatever, is in a sense going to provide a pathway out. So, as you say, we discussed earlier the how we got into it, and obviously there's wheels within wheels, and the big wheel is the failure after 1989 to establish an inclusive, equitable post-Cold War peace order in Europe. That's the first thing. We discussed that. But a second thing, of course, which we perhaps needed to accentuate even more, is the issue of, the big picture about the shape of the international politics. And I've been arguing for quite a long time that there's two levels in operation at the moment. The first one is the Charter International System, the United Nations System of International Law, established in 1945. Within that, you had two suborders, the Soviet one, which collapsed in 1989, and the US-led one, the Liberal International Order, as they like to call it, the rules-based order, and all of that. But what we've found even more accentuated, in my mind, in latest years, is the fact that within this, what I now call the political West, within the political West shaped and made by the Cold War, which is, and perpetuates the Cold War in the form of NATO and aspirations to global hegemony and dominance in terms of the ideology of democratism, and so on, that we're faced with, within the political West, the powerlessness of the European allies. That's been what's been very shocking over the last few months. I've lauded and supported the attempts by Emmanuel Macron, of Olaf Scholz, the two major figures in European politics, to maintain and keep dialogue with Putin, certainly before the war, and Macron since, in a very desultory manner. However, whatever we may feel about Macron personally, the fact that he makes statements and then seems to be changing his views every time his audience changes, but which seems to, I don't know what their feeling is in France, but certainly it's certainly quite powerful resonance here. But the fact is that even if he did want to do something more substantively, I'm not sure that the actual shape of the political West, as it has become consolidated even more in the last few months, whether they can do anything. So, quite apart from the fact that Germany is now emerging as, well, in a rather frightening new manifestation of Germany involved, not now talking of sending, the next Ramstein meeting in perhaps France and Germany will be sending tanks and armored vehicles and so on. I mean, this is shocking development.
And I spoke last night to the editor of antiwar.com, Dave the Camp, and he sort of came to the agreement with me on this, and I'd like to have your view. It just seems that nobody is trying to take their foot off the pedal here, like in this entire conflict. We have build-up, we have escalation, we have war breaking out. I understand, it's difficult. As you said, there's lots of orders and geopolitics at play, but the argument for diplomacy seems to be becoming more and more difficult as this war progressed.
Absolutely. The scope for diplomacy has diminished almost to vanishing point, because there's no substantive basis on which even negotiations or a truce or ceasefire, let alone even an armistice, could take place. You're absolutely right. I mean, I agree with that perspective. And worse than that, where we would in the past have expected some sort of resistance to militarism to emerge, that is, on the left. It hasn't. It's the anti-war movement. I mean, it's more active in the United States, which is very commendable. I'm in contact with quite a few people out there, and I gather there's going to be a big demonstration in the next week or so, I think, gathering at the Lincoln Memorial. But we have nothing like that in the UK. We have had marches in Berlin and in Italy, I think. But the issue which has exercised me quite a lot lately is on what basis do we, who oppose the wars, I know I do, on what basis, intellectual basis, do we develop a sustained critique, or in other words, anti-militarism? And on that basis, I think all the work that we've been discussing can feed into that we need to understand the character of the political West, the acceptance that there may be different types of political system out there, because one thing which has become even more clear over the last few months is the way that this Russo-Ukrainian confrontation is embedded in the larger Russian confrontation with the political West. But that in itself is only part of a story with a political West now lining up to take on China, which adds yet another level. So us, the anti-militarist line must say, look, stop this madness, stop this escalation, not just on the Ukrainian front, the escalation of Russian political West war, which could lead, that's the one which could lead to a nuclear escalation, and vis-a-vis China. We've got to step back. But as you say, everybody's stepping on the accelerator pedal, stepping on the gas, or in this case, blowing up the gas pipelines, but not. And what I wanted to say is, what would be the basic postulates of an anti-war position? First, we'll then have to discuss those positions on how Ukraine would be sorted. But that's only part, or we start at the other end, the big picture, and then work down to the more local one.
So you think there has to be a more holistic approach? I mean, a global international order one, and then the obvious one: stop the violence, stop the killing. Because I'm trying to get death figures, and nobody seems to be able to provide me any statistics. They seem to be propagandized for whoever is involved. But it's something to 100,000 Ukrainians and probably Russians as well dead in this war. It's sort of the numbers that's been thrown around. Whether they're accurate, I have no way to verify them, frankly. But that quantity of life being lost should be the very basis of saying, let's bring this conflict to whatever end we can before we talk maybe of the bigger picture. Or do you think maybe the bigger picture must come first and then that language as well? How should one approach it?
Yeah, I think, as we just said, there's absolutely no basis for compromise within the Ukrainian bubble, if you like. I mean, the bubble in the sense of within that envelope of issues. Ukrainian demands are maximalist, Russia to leave, not just to go back to the position before the 24th of February last year, but now Crimea and the whole Donbass. You can understand the argument, of course, but it doesn't get us anywhere in terms of putting an end to this. We could then talk, going back to the peace which was on the table on the 29th of March, negotiated in Istanbul, which would take us back to the status quo ante before the war began, and then bracketing the other issues. And of course, that was blocked by the Anglo-Americans, and Boris Johnson shot off to Kiev to put an end to that. But, since there's, both sides are deeply entrenched, that both sides feel that they can win the war, in the sense gaining position, but no one's going to win, but improve their bargaining position. So therefore, all roads lead back to Washington. Ultimately, it's their decision, and
Moscow. Because one critique I got last time was that we are letting Moscow off the hook sometimes with the discourse, and this is often a discourse being, and I don't want to misrepresent the people who say this to me, because it's been a discourse saying that those who are in the anti-war movement are pro-Russian, which I think is ridiculous. But there has been some people saying, look, to also bring the conflict, there must be some kind of anti-war intellectual movement, at least in Russia as well. And the critique that I think has been, fair, has been that, we are trying to find the solutions only in the West, and we're not looking towards Russia as well, maybe.
I think that's a fair criticism, that the any peace would have to be holistic, and that would then have to include the issue, Russia, Moscow has to be in that position, and then you have effectively three positions emerge. Some sort of deal with Moscow, but not this regime, not with Putin. So therefore, you're talking about changing the regime. That is unlikely. I mean, the political opinion polls and so on is just simply that's not a credible position. Equally, by the way, Moscow's position of trying to see Zelensky some sort of internal coup in Kiev as well is unlikely. It's not excluded. If we remember that one of those major figures who did speak to a joint House of Congress way back was Diem, the South Vietnamese leader, and we know what happened to him with the US gave a go-ahead for a coup, and he was then killed in 1963, I think. So, that's not excluded. I think that the political situation in Ukraine is more fragile. I'm not advocating anything, but more fragile and more tense than perhaps superficial views would suggest. The second position on Moscow is, of course, then if he is not going to change, then defeat on the battlefield would force Moscow to give up his positions, which is again unlikely because I think we're in for a long war of attrition. And then the third one is speaking to Putin and coming to a deal. What would be his realistic lines as of today? Because the longer the war goes on, as far as Moscow is concerned, the more Ukraine has to give up, if one can put it like that.
Yeah.
And so the deal on the 29th of March was not a bad, it was, everything was bad because it destroyed European security order, but the least bad option. And as time passes, all the options get worse, possibly for both sides, because the fourth thing, of course, is the option that not just Putin stays on, but the Russian economy tanks. Complete fails. It doesn't, again, that doesn't look as if that's going to happen. But of course, sanctions take time to work through. Can I just say a fifth point in all of this is, of course, again, I keep bringing in China, because if this is a war, and it is a war now between the political West and Russia, then China cannot afford to see Russia fail, and it cannot afford to see Russia lose, because the way that Washington is framing it, we'll deal with Russia first, and then we'll get on to dealing with China. So they're not stupid in Beijing, and they see this. So
it seems to be the choices in the US election at this stage has been you can either choose whether you want a war of Russia or a war of China. It's just insanity what's going on over there.
Absolutely. It's a sign of the intellectual exhaustion of the political West.
The last time you were on here, you spoke and you said this war might, you were speculating a bit, mobilize the global south. Now, the global south, in my view, comes down to mainly India, usually as the big democracy. Of course, it's not only India, but those countries have called, at least for some restraint. Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister of Foreign Affairs, early on when Anthony Blinken was there on a state visit, said a very remarkable statement, though she was criticized in our media, that we're asking for peace first. We're not taking sides here. We want to work towards peace and reconciliation. India said something similar, though they sort of weighing up their bets. But what role do you think the global south has to play in this?
I think that this was in evidence at the G20 summit in Bali a couple of months back, when the Indonesian leadership first refused to submit to the bullying of the West, the political West, because they didn't want Russia to be invited even. Lavrov, the foreign minister, did attend, but there was a whole stack of things that which Indonesia refused to accept from the West, and it was also reflected in the final communique, which didn't accept the Western wording, but said there were other views as well, which was quite a bold statement and a major development. The way I see this theoretically is that what we're now seeing is the maturation of the international system. When the United Nations was established, in 1945, there were about 55 countries initially represented. Since then, we've had decolonization. There's now 200 states in the world, 193 in the United Nations. And 75 years after the foundation of the UN, they're now demanding for their voice to be heard. The G20, we also have a whole stack of countries queuing up to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as well as the BRICS, incidentally, including Egypt and others. So there's a clear sense, I think, that even more since the beginning of this war, a more articulated response from the global south. It's still beginning. I'm now beginning to conceptualize this in terms of the emergence of a political East to as the counterpart of the political West, even though its operative frameworks are very, very different. Refusing, for example, the bloc politics that dominates in the West, its militaristic aspect, and so on. In fact, it's the precise repudiation. But the political East is a child of the Charter, the UN system, and it stands in defense of its principles, which of course have been egregiously flouted by all that's in the North in the last, certainly in this war, and for longer than that.
How do you sort of conceptualize this? Because, I mean, I spoke here to Trita Parsi last year on Iran, and he made another statement which is relevant here, which was that essentially he said that countries, when they become too powerful, even if they're democratic, they stop caring less about human rights. And it's generally the smaller countries who get to point the fingers and saying you're violating human rights. Do you sort of, so, if I put that in another context, it would be that, even if India might be some leader of the global south or Indonesia, I mean, these are massive population centers, they would also not necessarily defend human rights because for the sake of defending human rights, they might do it for some kind of other, geostrategic principle, while the smaller countries might be, more inclined to point out that finger for their own survival. I mean, do you share some view of that sort as well?
Yes, I do, because it's human rights and in general, the importance of international law. So human rights is only one aspect of it. I mean, I think the danger has been over the last few years is the instrumentalization of the use of human rights, is that when you want to attack someone, it's now one of the useful cudgels. But when you've got an ally who egregiously abuses human rights, you turn a blind eye. And so the intense politicization. And of course, the larger question, what is an ethical foreign policy? We had this difficulty with a new Labour, Robin Cook, who announced this after in the new Labour years, late 90s, early 2000s, and found himself, he found himself, on all sorts of ethical dilemmas. Today, we have the Green Party in Germany, which is the most, claims to be standing on the ethical high ground, but actually one of the most militaristic and warmongering, hawkish parties in the political West today.
What do you, east of Germany is Poland, and what do you make of the militarism that's sort of common in the Eastern European countries? Because it seems to me at times to be a little bit of a paranoid, Russophobic reaction as well.
I wouldn't use the word little bit, it's massively so. What we have now is the emergence of this new East Bloc, to use the US terminology, of the Iraq War. We have the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Poland, and the United Kingdom, which have established this extraordinarily hawkish bloc, which, as you say, no limits to escalation. I think that France and Germany do have limits, and I think that they have been more responsible. Italy, even more so, one has to say. Hungary, in this respect, perhaps one of the most pragmatic, if one wants to put it that way. But yes, we have a block of extraordinary militaristic countries. I'm constantly reminded of Poland's role in the 1930s, where it prevented the emergence of collective security order, and in fact, aligned with Nazi Germany because of its virulent anti-Soviet, anti-Russian behavior. And Poland, I speak as a Pole, so I think I'm allowed to say it, that its behavior today is utterly irresponsible. Utterly. It's been hugely generous in welcoming millions of Ukrainian refugees, and I think that's absolutely the right thing to do, is give them support, help, housing as much as possible. Of course, it's a generous and humanitarian support, I'll never condemn it and never question it. But in terms of geopolitics, it's at the moment mobilizing hundreds of thousands of forces. It's got 90,000 strong core military alliance on the Ukrainian border today. Moscow is saying they may go for a land grab. I doubt it. But of course, there's some voices saying that Lvov is and even Minsk are ancient. Well, of course, that would also involve Vilnius as part of the old Polish-Lithuanian empire.
But isn't the Polish and Ukrainian language mutually intelligible as well, to some extent?
Not really. They're all. It's on a spectrum. So you have Polish is a West Slav language, and Ukrainian and Russian are East Slav. But Ukrainian has borrowed many words from Polish and Hungarian to evolve. So yes, to a degree, it's these are Slavic languages, so they've all sorts of cognates and understanding. So, but with a bit of effort, yes, you can. But Russian
it explains some of it. But I know. I mean, I follow Polish media, and I can only understand the English version of it. And as you're right, I mean, it is so hawkish in the war and so in support, and they have been spinning this brotherhood narrative as well. I've read a little bit of that, so I was wondering where it all comes from. It might just be geopolitics, and this is the thing they go for at this stage.
Well, one has to say that the anti-Russian feeling amongst the Polish elites or government, certainly this one, has been frightening, and this has been one of those factors all the way back to the post-communist years, because I've always said, there were the 3 Copenhagen criteria when joining the European Union, political, economic, and state capacity factors. But a 4th one should have been peace and reconciliation, instead of which these countries use the European Union and its membership in NATO and the EU to amplify historical grievances rather than overcoming them. Now, I accept, my father's buried 100 meters from the Katyn monument in the Kensington and Chelsea Cemetery in West London, Gunsbury Cemetery, so, and he escaped by the skin of his teeth from not being one of those murdered in Katyn. So again, I know whereof I speak, but nevertheless, it's crazy. The fact is that everybody's got historical grievances. The whole point of this, what I've been trying to argue for, a positive peace order after 1989, it was within our grasp, and it didn't fail for some abstract structural reasons, as Mearsheimer would argue. It was because of decisions, and in particular, those East Europeans who insisted on relitigating historical grievances rather than overcoming them. And this fed into this mobilization and this intellectual framework, which has facilitated this war now.
But I mean, sort of asking you now again to speculate, but how theoretically would one bring some kind of peace and reconciliation? I suppose it starts with bringing peace to historical narratives, because my understanding of Eastern European countries has been every country has its own narrative to some extent, and they are incommensurable at sometimes. They just don't want to talk to each other. And because they don't accept a common history, the history is so propagandized and abused by their own leaders, that allows the leaders to get away with this kind of nonsense.
Absolutely. And I hold the European Union responsible to a large part in failing to deal with this. As I said, European Parliament has all the way back more than a decade ago started passing resolutions equating Nazism and Soviet Stalinist communism. Now, a repudiation of this equivalence doesn't mean support for Stalinism or its appalling, abysmal actions, but they were different. The historical context, the geopolitical framework were very, very different. And the attempt to reduce it, which is what the Poles did. I mean, I'll tell you that twice I've been shocked by some of former Polish defense minister, a fellow called Bici, maybe it was about 2015, 2016, at a conference. In fact, then at lunch I was over the table with him, and I couldn't believe it when he said at that stage, Putin is worse than Hitler. At that point, I understood that, and that statement like that is, and from a former defense minister, to hold such views is so absurd, so dangerous, so ignorant, and so pregnant with new violence and new conflict, which of course has now burst out. So where do we begin? Well, and it's so easy to despair at the moment, because 1989, the end of the Cold War, even during the Cold War, there were all sorts of cultural exchanges and other elements going on. Today, this is far worse than the first Cold War, this second Cold War. So I suppose the first way to start is to start analyzing, how we got into it, is the thing we began to, and including an intellectual framework of what are the parameters of this second Cold War. I mean, you can call it what you like, but second Cold War, of this historical situation.
Yeah, and I think it's also got lessons for, just for wider audience than Europe. I mean, particularly in the African continent, we're also in a post-colonial era. It started more or less the same time, at least sub-Saharan Africa, than the end of the Cold War. We were about a few years before, a few years later, depending on the country. And there's the same need, I think, to conceptualize, first of all, what was meant with post-colonialism. It's not widely understood by the population. It's not widely understood by the intellectuals. And because of this, you have these societies that are, it's nation states born out of decolonization, but the national narrative was never there to begin with. And that's why we sit with the internal disputes. And in the case of Ukraine in particular, that internal dispute had a wider geopolitical context because you had a Russian-speaking minority there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it didn't need to be this way, is what we could say. It didn't need to be this way, and why it became this way. I mean, there were always internal tensions, and there would be, but they could have been worked through. But because of this failure, or the interest of the political West, the US-led political West, constantly was not going to, first of all, allow the European powers, the West European powers, any significant autonomy. It was absolutely obsessively opposed to pan-European initiatives of a neo-Gaullist sort put forward by Mitterrand earlier, and some of his successors in a rather vague manner. I mean, even Macron talked about it at a certain point. But so there were choices: the failure to make the OSCE a more substantive security organization when NATO enlargement took place, instead of really giving substantive powers to the NATO-Russia Council of 2002. They were swizzled because the promise was made, after failure of the 1997 Foundation Act, the Permanent Joint Council, that it's inadequate as 19 against 1, that the NATO-Russia Council was going to be a genuine body with 20 countries negotiating issues. And they quite clearly, explicitly stopped that happening. The Washington stopped it happening. So again, it's so easy for us, of course, to blame and always point the finger at Washington. But one has to say, in this case, the political elite within Washington, the neocons, as everybody calls them, have been consistently hawkish, consistently misunderstanding the situation, and consistently exacerbating conflicts, including.
Well, I would go further to say deliberately being provocative. Maybe not Russia, Ukraine. I don't want to get into that one, but there was a memo paper disclosed by WikiLeaks between John McCain and Tony Blair, where Tony Blair literally said they're going to try and, cause commotion in Russia's, what Russia considers as its spheres of influence. That's a deliberately provocative attitude by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, in correspondence with John McCain, who's a known warmonger. And that was the attitude.
I haven't seen it. That would be fascinating. But yes, it was indeed the attitude. Some of the wiser heads, even, and I hesitate to quote it, but some of the wiser heads, including Zbigniew Brzezinski, a passionate exponent of NATO enlargement. But even he, in his famous book, the Grand Chessboard of 1997, said that some sort of overarching security framework has to be established with Russia to allow then NATO enlargement to take place without provoking conflict. So even he understood it, and so whether he could be called a neocon or not, he was just a very, very hawkish academic, and and really quite a deep thinker. even though he had very narrow, again, part of that Polish background of, you have to push Russia back.
What critique would you? I mean, we can talk a lot about the critique being labeled against the neocons, and we can spend, days talking about it. But what critique would you label then against the Russian intellectuals, and what how they saw this war, and I suppose it comes down to Russia's place in the world. That's sort of a narrative they've been falling for as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's that's really an important question. Is that Russia, after the end of the Cold War, was offered a position in the political West, but like all countries, France, Germany, United Kingdom, it would have to accept elements of a subaltern position, and which may not have been bad. It would have provided a framework for economic development. It would have resolved the security things, but it would have had to given up any ambitions to be a great power. It would, it would be a medium power, like a legacy power, like France, Germany, and the UK, which is, they've done well, or Japan, they've done well within that framework. However, the Russian elites even the Democrats were unanimous in opposing that. So it's easy to blame the these hardliners, the hawkish Russian, but even the most mild-mannered, moderate intellectual, I know hundreds of them. I mean, it's going to say dozens, but more. Almost unanimous, apart from certain radical Democrats, unanimous in their view that Russia has, is a great power, not a militaristic one necessarily, but a country whose views have to be taken into account as a permanent member of the Security Council, which, of course, Ukraine and many people now want to deprive it of. So this was, the first position, that it's almost unanimous. And, Putin, when he came into power, wanted to resolve the impasse over NATO enlargement and the larger security issues, including, talking about Greater Europe. So it was
how has Putin's views though evolved since he came into it? Because I read Peter Conradi's book now on the West Lost Russia, some book of this sort, and when Putin came to power, first of all, he seemed to have been a lot of inexperience. Guy obviously learns of the time, but it would seem that he's also hardened some of his views as time evolved.
Absolutely, he more than hardened. They've ossified even. I look at it in terms of for the first 12 years, 2000 to 2012, including the Medvedev years, the vision was to try to find a formula to break the impasse. And so initially he said, Russia should join NATO or have some sort of body outside of it. And by the Munich Security Conference of 2007, his famous speech in February 2007, by then it was quite clear. But his speech, denouncing a unipolar order, wasn't so much a denunciation. It was a warning. Just listen to our concerns. And of course, then Bush was talking about NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia in the Bucharest summit in April 2008. And then, of course, the Libya intervention in early 2011 really shocked them. So by the time he comes back to power in 2012, he says, you can't deal with the West. And we were on the slope, which led to the war later. And then, of course, it's couched in all of this language of civilizational struggle and so on. The West is degenerate, and, all this transgender stuff and all the LGBT, which I regard as absolutely regrettable, catastrophic for Russia itself. But I'm become more and more critical of the language of a civilizational state. And Russia now, since 2012, describes itself as a civilizational state. Because what it does, it erodes liberal freedoms, which and indeed the freedoms embedded in the Charter International System, which Russia and the Soviet Union signed up to and should be defending. And what it does is reduce complexity. It's another form of narrow nationalism, which I find just deeply disturbing.
Yeah, but how should Russia then define itself? We're talking here about something else, and the one quote that I have, is from Peter Conradi, who said something that I'm going to misquote him here, but it's something of the sort that Russia should define itself in terms of its own achievements and not this larger, sort of imperial narrative. And that's perhaps the change that needs to occur in Russia, because the fact of the matter is half of Ukraine at this stage, probably more than half, because even the Russian part don't like it, hates the Russians at this moment. They don't see themselves as part of the greater Russian narrative anymore.
No, indeed. There's hate on both sides, and within Russia now, there's this virulence of the language is deeply frightening. So it'll take generations to overcome this hostility on both sides. But don't forget that even from the Donbass, including Zaporozhye and Kherson, that tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of the Russophone people have fled to Russia itself. So there is a framework in which, a Russophone base, if you like. Yes, the even more neutral parts of Ukraine have obviously, given the ferocity and the awfulness of the war, turned against Russia, absolutely. But ultimately, it's no good just perpetuating the conflict. We have to find a way of transcending it, and a generous settlement at the end of the war would be the first path towards reconciliation. And it would be what I've been arguing for right from the beginning, one which is multilingual, multicultural, and open-hearted, within a democratic, sovereign, independent Ukrainian nation state. But the longer this war goes on, some of the Russian, former relatively liberal Russians are now openly talking about the former Ukraine, that the goal now is to destroy Ukraine as a state. Now, that sort of maximalism is definitely frightening, but it's now the common discourse, because both sides are being polarized and taken to intensity, given the fact that the West is now openly aligning with a vision of Ukrainian state, which excludes the Russophone and etc., etc.
Do you have access still to Russian media? I mean, what is the propaganda like in Russia, if you've got any idea?
Yes, well, I tend not. I did when I've been there, watch the Solovyov program and Dmitry Kiselyov and all of that, and also plenty of reports come back from Gilbert Doctorow and others who talk about these. Plus, of course, I'm constantly online with all sorts of elements. Just published, for example, in a journal which is still very, very good and reflective of the best thinkers in Russia, a journal called Russia in Global Affairs. This is edited by Fyodor Lukyanov, and based effectively at the Higher School of Economics, and the other agencies work with it, and the Russian International Affairs Council. These are all people putting forwards a moderate, reasoned analysis. But as the war becomes more and more entrenched, positions are becoming tougher and tougher and less reconcilable to a peace dialogue. So Russians, as always, when they're under attack, they go back now. They're attacked by the Mongols in 1236, Swedes in 1709, Poles in 1612, no, the other way around, Napoleon in 1812, Nazis in 1941. And so this is now, it isn't just state propaganda. I've talked to a lot of Russians. They know, and I've not seen any enthusiasm for the war, apart from very marginal figures. No enthusiasm for this war, but a sort of grim determination that we've got to see this done. That the West has effectively forced this war on us. Well, I'm not endorsing that argument, but certainly that's how overwhelmingly it's perceived. That's why support for Putin today is still just under 80%, which is the Levada figures, relatively independent. Of course, polling is difficult in war situations, but still it suggests a certain solidity.
So the idea that Putin is going to be taken out in a coup d'etat, or the Russian people are going to overthrow him, I mean, you are very skeptical of that idea.
Yeah, I think it's extremely unlikely. I will say, though, that we've hit a time in which everything is just so volatile that prediction is always a mug's game. But today, more than ever, running on this, specifically on the war itself, I read enormous amount on this. If you listen to the likes of Doug McGregor and Scott Ritter, well, Russia's mobilizing, will be launching an offensive, and it's got the capacity to drive down from from Belarus and to separate Kiev from Poland, to intercept the tanks and so on that may be coming from the west. But if you read some other very good, respectable reports, then Russia is absolutely at the limit of its capacity, and it's heading for defeat of one form or another. Certainly battlefield defeat.
It goes that line cuts through everything. Every fact is disputed. I mean, I remember the hospital in Mariupol and Bucha. There was an accusation that Ukraine staged it, and then there was an accusation that Russia staged certain attacks. And as a member of the public, I suppose I can't make sense of anything at this stage. I just know there's a war going on. I don't even know if I could verify any number, any death, and sometimes I doubt that certain events have occurred, given the nature of the propaganda.
Absolutely. And this goes back all the way, I mean, obviously earlier, but no doubt to the downing of the Malaysian Airlines MH17 in July 2014, which started this new epoch of sanctions. And the trial has finished now in Holland, in the Netherlands. But astonishing, you could go through the whole list of anomalies which haven't been addressed. The fact that even just a simple fact that they accepted evidence from the Dutch and from the Ukrainians, but not from Russia, even though the Russians were saying simply look at the number on the bit of the missile or whatever it was which destroyed the plane. Just look at the number, and this belongs to a missile that was in the armory of the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, that may or may not be the case, but let's have that tested by independent experts. But it wasn't. And, the list goes on to several dozen fundamental points. John Kerry was saying that they had radar and they could trace the projectiles. Later on, when asked, well, show it to us. No, we didn't. The fact that Ukrainian air traffic controlled stuff was destroyed. I mean, immediately afterwards. And as I said, the list goes on and on. And
well, it's clearly a sign of war propaganda and deliberate deception, and for all we know, these events might even be authentic, and we're being misled by somebody else's narrative. That's how I see it, and I guess this also speaks to a point that I've been trying to raise for some time, is that the failure of truth and reconciliation commissions, if there's ever going to be one, okay, and it's just partially a failure of the South African one, although ours was more successful than other countries, I would argue, was that cross-examination was never extensively used. It was used selectively. And I think if there is going to be something that is really a point we need to argue for, that the truth must be established, as uncomfortable as it is,
Absolutely. I think so. I think that some basic facts have to be assessed. For example, an independent commission on all those events which you've talked about, and in the UK context on the Skipout case, which still is full of mysteries and ellipses and strange coincidences, and even timeline is not agreed. The timeline put forwards by the Metropolitan Police doesn't correspond to what eyewitnesses say happened. For example, a sequence of the Skripals going to lunch or have a drink at the bar before going to Zizi's restaurant, or vice versa. Simple fact. Witnesses says it was this way. The Metropolitan Police says it was the other way. I mean, I don't know, but it's clearly. I'd like to know, though, what actually happened. Why the chief nursing officer of the British Army was there? It could have been pure incident. Could have been a coincidence. But yet, when the BBC made a film of it, they didn't show. They precisely didn't have her in the film whatsoever. Well, that raises some questions. Why not?
But of course, they don't want to open that can of worms, because that would imply that our own media is being manipulated. And I think there's good enough suspicion that that is the case. I would say that rather unreservedly, they can accuse me of whatever they want. I want to get you to the other point that we should speak to you is the nature of Ukraine at this stage, because it's obviously the country being attacked, and we shouldn't be downplaying the aggression. I mean, what is your understanding of the politics at the moment and the humanitarian crisis?
Well, I mean, the humanitarian crisis and the fact that the whole state is being kept up by Western subsidies, not just militarily now, but the budget and the economy. I mean, it's obviously catastrophic. As you say, the information coming out is highly politicized, and one has to say that the Zelensky administration has been absolute master in terms of dominating the narrative and shaping the narrative and shaping the stories, with many interesting points put forward by Arestovich, who is quite an interesting guy, and all the others. So, there's no sign of, a slackening of the commitment to some sort of victory in the war. But, I have not been on the ground, so it's difficult to tell. But, it's, that in a sense, of course, the whole issue has been the fact that Ukrainian public space has been shaped for so long by a single dominant voice. Since 2014 in particular, as the 11 political parties were abolished. There's only one media outlet, state media. So the propaganda effort is absolutely huge. And the part of the Ukrainian population has been, if you like, shifted in this rather a nationalist. It's not ethno-nationalist, by the way. It's why I call it a type of monist nationalism, which is quite broad in terms of its ethnic competition. Obviously, Zelensky is Jewish, but unfortunately, the Ukrainian public space has been shaped by this particular Galician narrative for too long, which was excluding the different visions of statehood in Donbass. But before 2014, certainly, and this is why I supported the Minsk Accord, the vision always was, including the Russophone population, I've never said otherwise, most of the Russophone population were committed to developing a democratic, multilingual, sovereign Ukraine. And even in the Donbass, opinion polls showed the majority supported that position. And yet they've fluffed it. The Ukrainian state and nation building endeavor is in greater danger today than it has been since the civil war back after the Bolshevik Revolution.
So critics to that would say, they probably wouldn't deny the attempt, on that you could call it the eastern or the western Ukrainian side to, play up a more ethno-nationalist or mono-nationalist, as you say, vision. But the critics to that would also say we must take into account the attempts by Moscow to manipulate the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah, I don't like that argument. I mean, not whether I like it or not is not important, but I just don't think it's correct. It's like, I've talked to so many people from the Donbass over the years, and they've all voiced these concerns. They were not anybody's puppets. And I think this argument, including, whatever I say in terms of let's listen to the arguments of all sides. Oh, you're a Putin stooge. That sort of argument is playground talk. The people in the Donbass, they have their own political subjectivity, their own concerns, and just after 2014, when things were a bit easier, and I spoke to quite a lot of people, for example, from Donetsk State or National University, and these were people that very reasonable, overwhelmingly saying, look, we wanted this to work within the Ukrainian state, as a multilingual, to be able to maintain, Russian language in the Donbass, in our university, but we couldn't. Ultimately, they were squeezing, and when we had recourse to this isn't to deny Russian involvement. This isn't to deny that that they did have it. We've got the tapes, and so on. Of course, Russia did want to shape it, but but to reduce the subjectivity would be to say Ukraine is just simply a tool of Washington. It's not. These countries are. Have got their own concerns, and these regions have their own concerns. And Crimea, by the way, I was there not long after the, let's call it neutrally, reunification with Russia. And, going everywhere where I went, such overwhelming support. I asked, what did you do during the referendum to people at Simferopol University? And they'd gone back to their home country, Kherson and elsewhere, agitating and saying, this is what we've been waiting for. And it reflected the aspirations of the Crimea all the way back to independence time, the referendum of 1991, all of those activities.
So, okay, so you make the argument still that, and I've heard it from others as well, that Crimea should be seen as a different sort of group towards the Russians in the Donbass. They have two different historical perspectives.
Yes, but the Donbass itself has a very strong its own perspective, and one shouldn't negate the fact that there is a Russophone constituency which wanted and always wanted good relations with Russia trading and culturally while being part of the new Ukrainian democratic sovereign state. Unfortunately, that option was closed down by the dominance of a Galician element, more nastily, you could say, a Banderaite way of looking at it, which I don't think was dominant for a long time. And indeed, all of these divisions exacerbated by the political West, which simply argued that the democratic thing to do was to join NATO and to move to the West. Whereas others, even when the figures were opposed to it, as Vladimir Ishchenko showed, there was no majority for NATO membership. Even EU membership as late as 2013 or association with the EU was, far more finely balanced than later narratives would suggest.
How do you see this sort of thing evolving? Because the war is obviously still ongoing. Again, we don't really have any sense of the intensity of the conflict. But Ukraine is basically a de facto member of NATO now, and it's probably going to be a de facto member of the European Union, if not a permanent member. So how do you see this, new reality playing itself out geopolitically?
This, of course, was the case with Ukraine. Was a de facto member of NATO since 2014. It didn't, obviously, membership was not on the cards for many, many years. But the fact that leading NATO members were increasingly working with its army and, building it up. And as we see with Poroshenko said it, and Angela Merkel in a famous interview with Zeit, German thing, where they said, look, the Minsk Accords were simply playing for time, giving us time to build up the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, they may be retrospectively justifying their positions in going for the Minsk and saying, well, against their own hawkish critics. So you can understand that's possible. But if it's true what they're saying, then this is absolutely shocking. How on earth can Moscow deal with political leaders of the political West who openly say, we were lying with you, to you, we were leading you along, while at the same time, every 6 months, the EU is renewing these sanctions unanimously under German leadership to punish Russia for not fulfilling a Minsk Accords, which Germany had never any intention of fulfilling itself.
Or, if what she says was sincere, and I hope it's not a misinterpretation or something of the cameras, it's frankly criminal, to do that.
Absolutely. And Francois Hollande said more or less the same thing as well, by the way.
I mean, but what do you make of this, that our leaders, and it's like, I mean, until last year, Macron was still 50-50 about this war and talking to Russia, right? Every leader in Europe is now singing Washington's tune. There is no dissent anymore.
Apart from Hungary, Viktor Orban.
Yeah, okay, but Orban is not really the popular guy in the media, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. No, and I think Italy, of course, Meloni, the prime minister, comes from a right-wing tradition, so she's traditionally comes from an anti-Soviet, anti-Russian position, even though I think that the government has been relatively balanced in its views lately. But the fundamental issue is, of course, even more the fact that the European Commission and Ursula von der Leyen have been absolutely the worst and cheerleaders for extreme militarization, trying to work out, as we've seen in the last few days, a 9th package of sanctions when there's hardly anything left to sanction. What is their end goal? It's to destroy Russia. Well, it's going, Russian EU relations are going to be, never will they go back to anything before. And so Russia will constantly, obviously it makes sense to work to undermine the EU. Why shouldn't it? Because you've got a body which we would have anticipated the EU as a peace project, which it did brilliantly vis-a-vis France and Germany, should have extended this to the Western European prosperous countries and those in the East, rather than simply developing its own narrow corporate interests in expanding its own membership to the East in a conflictual manner with a major power to the East, Moscow, which it refused to accept as a major power following the US-Washington line. Catastrophic. So the quality of leadership is abysmal.
Yeah, and the thing that gets me here is that they knew this was going to trigger a reaction. They were
Yeah.
well aware of this, and they still went on with this.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I don't even know if you can call it hypocrisy or what one should call it, but the fact that you knew there was going to be a conflict, the fact that they knew that Minsk II could have solved or at least mediate the conflict. I mean, I think we might be wrong for holding up Minsk II as an ultimate peace treaty, but it was a start. It was an approach for diplomacy to occur. And all of those channels have now been shut down. And equally so on the Russian side, there seems to be no attempt, by them to try and also de-escalate the tensions. And sort of to just get a last view on this is, have we forgotten that both countries have nuclear weapons here?
Yeah, indeed. No. Well, this is how the hawks are saying, well, Russia's just bluffing with its nuclear weapons. Well, of course, it's a bluff that I wouldn't want to call, to be honest. Our great leader, the Mad Queen Liz Truss, when she was our leader, openly to talk in the way she did about her willingness to use nuclear weapons, readiness to use it. Now, all leaders have to be ambiguous about it. That's the whole point of deterrence. But her language went beyond anything we ever heard by any major leader, certainly not in the first Cold War and never since. So that level of irresponsibility and ignorance is so shocking, and she's not the only one. And of course, the buffoonery of the Boris Johnson leadership. It's, of course, you have him as a buffoon, got on very well with Zelensky as another dramatist. And so clearly it would be a relationship which was a very dangerous one, which feeding the illusions of both of those. And so where today is the statesman? And we have to look to Henry Kissinger, who's 102 years old, which shows just how bad the situation is.
I mean, Kissinger, the guy involved in Cambodia and in East Timor. I mean, that isn't my first speak for diplomacy, but if that's all you've got, I mean, it's all we have to use at this stage.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's absurd. There's another scenario that people have been talking of, which is that Ukraine is basically going to turn into a Korea-like situation, and that might maintain a peace, although it's an uncomfortable peace because it's essentially armies, a new Berlin Wall, if you will, type of story. What do you make of that?
Yes, I think that's possibly one of the most likely things. That's why I've not, I'd like negotiations and some sort of genuine ceasefire, which would be opening to negotiations. But what I'm now suggesting is possibly an armistice. And that's the armistice which was imposed in Korea in 1953. But it took 2 years after, the North invaded the South, and the South, the American forces pushed almost to the Chinese border. Then they were pushed back to where they began after the first year. And then they slogged it out for 2 more years, in which hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians died. But they could have had the armistice 2 years earlier. I think possibly in 2 years' time, when we have an armistice like that, where after hundreds of thousands more have died, when we could have had it now. So it's an armistice I'm talking about now, an armistice. Just simply stop it. But that won't, Kiev can't do it, Moscow can't do it. It has to come. Russia would accept it, but I'm pretty sure Russia would accept it. Freeze the situation where it is now, because at least it's got something out of it. It's got water going to Crimea, it's got that land bridge, and so on. But Kiev won't, but it'll only do it just like South Vietnam, or accepted it, or Pyongyang, or Seoul in 1953. It has to come again from Washington, because I keep saying Washington because in the past I'd have said European or Western leaders. There is no Western leader. There is only Washington today, which is again frightening.
But is the leadership in Washington? I mean, I would have thought that the current head of the CIA, Bill Burns, speaks Russian. He's been to Moscow. He seems to understand the situation, understood it before the war went up. You'd think that would be a competent person to deal with the situation. And, it's again disappointing that he just falls in line with whatever the party line is saying.
Yes. I must say the fact that Bill Burns, as you say, with long experience, he was serving in Moscow in the early 90s, speaks it. And he's one of the best US diplomats of his generation. And that's the only thing, the fact that the head of the CIA is an intelligent, which gives me a slight sense that we're not. And remember, he made this opening to his counterpart, and they had a meeting, I've forgotten where, a few months ago. So I think that the head of the CIA, the fact that he is one of the only serious, competent diplomats on the Western side gives us a little bit of hope that we may find a pathway to an armistice, if not to a ceasefire and negotiations.
Okay, and then sort of last question for you, final last question. The role of the arms manufacturers and weapons. I mean, I suppose it concerns you, but what is your thinking on all the weapons that we're just throwing at this problem?
Yeah. Well, indeed. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about whether Russia is running out of shells, because the war so far has been a war of attrition, and who can produce it. I mean, Russia, I've heard contradictory statements about whether Russia has exhausted its old stores of the, what's it called, 152 mil shells, which is the main Soviet model, or not. And the fact that the West is trying to scrape together everything it can to throw at this war, and that it may become more airborne in the next few months. So yeah, it's not clear. But as you say, the weapons manufacturers are doing jolly well. And of course, this again is that model which of that political West, which would then come back to why, when we're trying to explain what's going on today, we have to go back to 1945, the establishment of what many people call the Trumanite state, or the deep state, or the military industrial complex, as described by that communist Eisenhower in his farewell address, which of course they're feeding it. And this was never dismantled at the end of the Cold War. And so it's perpetuated. NATO wasn't dismantled. The ideological apparatus of US exceptionalism and hegemony was not dismantled, and neither was the arms industry, which has a revolving door with the US political elite from Congress, and as we know,
and the media, which is more frightening as well.
And the media.
There is no dissenting discourse in the media at the moment, like there was with the Vietnam War, and I would even go as far as to say with the Iraq War, which I thought was abysmal, the dissenting discourse, but at least there was something. There's none at the moment.
It's very marginal. You have some excellent outfits like the Quincy Institute and the journal Responsible Statecraft, and some of the conservative outfits, the American Conservative, interestingly enough, the journal which from we're getting online has been has been saying some sensible things. The National Interest, of course, Dimitri Simes, and so in the United States, I think the level of debate is of an order higher than the one in the UK for sure. I don't know what it's like over in France or Germany.
Well, in France, it's a north-south divide, as is usual with our politics. So you find at Marseille, Sud Radio is with this man by the name of André Berkoff, who runs a program, and he's had a lot of dissenting voices on the war. And on YouTube, they get easily 500,000 views, which is enormous for France, right? Whether or not that has filtered into political decision-making, I'm not sure, because Macron won re-election, basically on a pro-NATO stance.
Yeah. But it was a rather close run thing than he would have liked, of course.
Well, he's lost the absolute majority in the parliament, which, might make some strange compromises. But in terms of the war, I think most people in France have just forgotten about it, which is even more frightening.
But how about Mélenchon and those guys? Are they...
Yeah, Mélenchon has been outspoken against it, and surprising Marine Le Pen. So you had this weird situation where the left and right is unified on one single issue, but that's about all they're unified on. So, the compromises and the deals going on does not seem to translate into policy at the moment.
No.
And I think Macron, if you would ask him, my suspicion is he is quite opposed as well to what's going on, but he doesn't have the platform to speak out, because the media narrative at this stage is so captured in France that, as I say, there's only one exception, which is in the south. The rest of it is all pro-NATO. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Anyway, so Richard, I'd like to thank you very much for this conversation. And if people can find your writing, who do you write and stuff on this war? Do you still write?
Yes, well, as I say, I got a piece just in the latest issue of Russia in Global Affairs, which tries to give a big picture of how I see the world situation developing now in defense of the United Nations and of the international system established in 1945, because we do, and I certainly stand in defense. I've always been a great fan of the United Nations. It's not a world government, but at least it, as its second, and I end with this, Dag Hammarskjöld, the second UN General Secretary, has put it, the UN was not established to build heaven on earth, but to prevent hell on earth. And so it's the best we've got, and we need to defend it.
Well, I encourage people to, please read that one, and please, if they see an interview of Richard, please watch. It's a very insightful words on Russia, and thank you very much.